Hey guys, tonight we're heading into Tudor England to discover some of the strangest jobs people actually performed for a living. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in Tudor England and discovering that you have somehow secured a position inside the royal household. You might picture yourself carrying secret documents, guarding a palace doorway, or perhaps pouring wine during one of Henry VIII's enormous banquets. Instead, you have been given responsibility for the king's toilet. Congratulations, your parents must be very proud. You are now the groom of the stool, one of the strangest yet surprisingly important positions in the Tudor royal household. And despite what the title might suggest, you are not grooming a particularly unfortunate horse. The stool is the king's portable toilet. Your working day brings you directly into the monarch's private chambers. You help with clothing and personal requirements surrounding his toilet routine, make sure the necessary equipment is prepared, and ensure that everything is clean and comfortable. It turns out ruling England is considerably easier when someone else handles the bathroom arrangements. But strangely enough, you have actually landed an excellent position. Your greatest advantage is access. Tudor politics revolves around proximity to the monarch. Powerful noblemen might spend days hoping Henry notices them. Courtiers compete for invitations, offices, favours, and a few precious minutes of private conversation. You simply wait until His Majesty needs the toilet. Political networking has rarely been more efficient. As part of the King's Privy Chamber, you can become someone Henry personally knows and trusts. You see him when much of the ceremony surrounding monarchy disappears. He might speak with you while dressing, relaxing, or attending to private matters. And when the king talks, you listen. You may hear information before other courtiers do. People seeking royal favour may suddenly become extremely interested in becoming your friend. Your proximity can help you gain influence, connections, gifts, and opportunities. So while another courtier is standing outside a chamber wearing his finest velvet and desperately hoping for 5 minutes with the king, you are already inside discussing matters of state, while holding something nobody wants described in detail. There is something wonderfully Tudor about that. You are simultaneously performing one of the least glamorous jobs imaginable and occupying one of the most privileged positions in England. The closer you get to the royal backside, apparently, the closer you get to political power. Of course, eventually the king finishes, and then your political influence temporarily becomes a sanitation problem. Still, things could be worse. Because outside the palace walls, other workers are dealing with exactly the same substance. Except instead of one royal contribution, they have an entire city's worth to remove. And unlike you, they do not get to call themselves gentlemen of the king's privy chamber. After spending your days dealing with the private needs of one extremely important Tudor, you might assume you have discovered the worst sanitation-related career England has to offer. You have not. Leave the royal palace behind and walk into the crowded streets of Tudor London. Thousands of people live packed together in houses, inns, workshops, and cramped neighbourhoods. Everyone eats. Everyone drinks. And unfortunately for you, everyone eventually produces something that has to go somewhere. There are no modern sewers carrying it conveniently away. Instead, waste collects in privies and cesspits beneath or behind buildings. Eventually, those pits fill. That is when someone comes looking for you. You are a gong farmer. Despite the surprisingly agricultural title, you will not be seeing many peaceful fields. Your job is to empty cesspits and remove human waste from the city. Even better, Much of your work takes place at night, when fewer people are around to complain about the smell. Very considerate of them. You arrive carrying basic equipment such as buckets and shovels. Then comes the part nobody mentioned enthusiastically during recruitment. You may have to climb into the cesspit. There, surrounded by accumulated human waste, you shovel the contents into containers so they can be hauled away and dumped beyond heavily populated areas. There are unpleasant jobs. Then there is standing waist-deep in Tudor sewage at midnight, wondering whether you should have become a baker. The smell is only part of the problem. Cesspits are cramped and dangerous places. You risk falling, becoming trapped, or breathing foul air in enclosed spaces. There are no protective suits, rubber gloves, or reassuring workplace safety posters reminding you to bend your knees when lifting. You simply get on with it. Yet, your disgusting occupation is essential. Without workers like you, overflowing cesspits would make already filthy Tudor neighbourhoods considerably worse. London produces waste every day, and someone must remove it. People may avoid you socially, but they become remarkably happy to see you when the pit behind their house begins approaching capacity. Suddenly, you are the most popular man in the neighbourhood, at least temporarily. When dawn approaches, you finish hauling away the night's collection. Respectable Londoners wake, open their doors, and continue their daily lives, probably without thinking much about who prevented yesterday's dinner from becoming today's street decoration. Your shift is finally over, and perhaps you can take comfort knowing there are Tudor jobs involving cleaner surroundings. Unfortunately, the next one involves spending your day deliberately hunting rats. After spending the night emptying cesspits, you may decide it is finally time for a cleaner profession. Excellent news. Your next clients are rats. As a rat catcher in Tudor England, you make your living hunting the rodents that thrive wherever humans store food, dump rubbish, and build crowded neighbourhoods. London provides all three in generous quantities, so business is rarely slow. Walk through the city, and you find rats almost everywhere they should not be. They squeeze into warehouses, kitchens, barns, taverns, granaries, and houses. Food stored in sacks or wooden containers provides an especially tempting target. And when someone discovers scratching behind the walls, they call you. There is no tidy van arriving with a company logo and a selection of modern traps. You rely on practical experience, simple traps, dogs, ferrets, and whatever techniques prove effective. Your greatest advantage is knowing your enemy. You learn where rats hide, where they feed, and the narrow routes they use between buildings. You inspect dark corners and storage areas for signs of activity. Essentially, you spend your career becoming extremely knowledgeable about places everyone else tries very hard not to examine. Then the hunt begins. Dogs could be particularly useful for killing rats quickly. Ferrets could help pursue vermin into confined spaces. Traps offered another solution, while poisons and other methods could also be used against unwanted animals. Naturally, none of this makes your working environment particularly pleasant. You crawl through filthy spaces, move around rubbish, and regularly encounter animals that have absolutely no intention of cooperating with their scheduled removal. There is also the small problem that rats bite. Apparently nobody explained customer service to them. Still, your occupation matters. Rats consume and contaminate valuable food supplies. For households already spending a significant portion of their resources on food, losing grain to rodents is more than an inconvenience. So although respectable Tudor society may not consider you particularly glamorous, people are very pleased when you arrive. You enter a house as the strange man carrying traps and possibly a determined little dog. You leave as the strange man carrying dead rats. Career progression. And once you have finished, you might decide that your next profession should involve peaceful countryside instead of dark buildings filled with angry rodents. Perhaps somewhere beside a quiet pond. That sounds relaxing. Unfortunately, you are about to remove your shoes, step into the water, and deliberately wait for blood-sucking creatures to attach themselves to your legs. After spending your days crawling through dark buildings hunting rats, you decide you need a calmer profession. Something outdoors, perhaps. Fresh air, quiet countryside, a peaceful pond. Perfect. You are now a leech collector. Your job is to gather the small, blood-sucking creatures used in medicine, and unfortunately, leeches are not particularly interested in climbing voluntarily into your basket. You need to attract them. One remarkably straightforward method is to enter shallow water and allow the leeches to attach themselves to you. So you roll up your clothing, step into a marsh or pond, and wait. Your legs are now professional equipment. This is probably the moment you begin reconsidering the rat business. Leeches matter because Tudor medicine is heavily influenced by the ancient theory of the four humours. Health is believed to depend on maintaining the proper balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When something seems wrong, removing blood can appear to physicians and practitioners like a perfectly reasonable solution, and removing blood requires tools. Fortunately for everyone except you, nature has already invented one. Once a leech attaches itself and begins feeding, you can remove and collect it for later medical use. Animals could also help attract leeches, but the basic principle remains wonderfully simple. Provide something warm and full of blood, and let the leech handle the introduction. You spend hours moving through wet ground and shallow water, exposing yourself to cold, mud, insects, and whatever else happens to be sharing the marsh. There are no waterproof boots. There is no pleasant heated vehicle waiting nearby. And there is certainly no employee wellness program. Your reward is a container filled with creatures whose defining professional skill is drinking blood. Still, someone will buy them. Medical practitioners use leeches as part of bloodletting treatments for various illnesses. From the Tudor perspective, removing supposedly excessive or badly balanced blood can help restore the body. You therefore occupy the very beginning of an unusual medical supply chain. The patient sees the practitioner sees the leech, and the leech has already seen rather too much of your ankle. Eventually you climb out of the water and inspect the day's collection. Perhaps tomorrow you will find employment somewhere warmer and drier. And technically, your next occupation does satisfy both requirements. Unfortunately, the warmth comes from crowds gathered around a scaffold, because your next Tudor profession is executioner. After spending your morning standing in cold marsh water collecting leeches, you decide you need a profession where nobody is trying to suck your blood. Unfortunately, you choose one where everyone is trying not to meet you. You are now a Tudor executioner. When a court sentences someone to death, somebody has to carry out the punishment. Depending on the crime and the condemned person's status, Tudor executions can take several forms. Hanging is common, while beheading is generally associated with higher status prisoners. Other punishments can be considerably more gruesome. Your responsibility is simple on paper. Make sure everything goes according to plan. This becomes considerably less simple when hundreds or even thousands of spectators are watching you. Public executions are spectacles. Crowds gather around scaffolds to see justice performed, hear final speeches, and witness the condemned person's last moments. You stand at the centre of it all, carrying the equipment everyone else is trying not to look at too closely. For a beheading, skill matters enormously. Ideally, one accurate blow ends the execution quickly. Miss badly, and suddenly you have created a situation that is uncomfortable for absolutely everyone involved, especially your customer. This means you must understand your tools. An axe or sword needs to be maintained properly, and you need enough strength and experience to deliver an effective strike. There is no convenient training simulator. Presumably, excellent communication skills is also fairly low on the list of requirements. Your social position is complicated. Society needs someone to perform executions, but that does not necessarily mean people want you living next door. Your profession surrounds you with death, punishment, and dishonour. Yet when an important prisoner reaches the scaffold, your competence suddenly matters enormously. Imagine being assigned the execution of a nobleman. He kneels. The crowd becomes quiet. You raise the axe. And at that exact moment you remember that yesterday was probably the day you should have sharpened it. Performance anxiety in Tudor England could be unusually specific. Once the sentence has been carried out, your work may continue. Bodies or remains sometimes need to be handled according to the punishment imposed, particularly when authorities want the consequences of treason or serious crime publicly displayed. Eventually, however, you leave the scaffold behind. Perhaps you decide your next occupation should involve children instead. Something quieter, safer, maybe even inside a royal palace. And technically that's exactly what you get. There is only one small problem. Whenever the young prince misbehaves, you may be the one who gets punished. After working as an executioner, you decide that royal service might offer something a little less grim. And it does. You are now a companion to a young prince. Wonderful. You live near the royal household, receive an education alongside someone destined to rule, and spend your days surrounded by tutors rather than scaffolds. There is, however, one rather unfortunate detail. If the prince misbehaves, you might be the one who gets punished. Welcome to the strange tradition associated with the whipping boy. The idea is based on a simple problem created by royal hierarchy. A prince occupies an exceptional position. His tutors are expected to educate and discipline him, yet physically striking the future monarch can be considered inappropriate. So what happens when your royal companion refuses his lessons? Apparently somebody finds another backside. You. The traditional story suggests that a whipping boy is chosen because he is emotionally close to the prince. When you are punished for something the prince has done, the prince is supposed to feel guilty watching his friend suffer. Essentially, your entire disciplinary purpose depends on friendship and second-hand regret. It is important, however, not to imagine every Tudor prince automatically walking around with an officially appointed child whose sole employment is being beaten. Historians debate how widespread and formal the practice actually was, and many familiar stories about whipping boys come from later traditions. Still, royal children certainly had companions, servants, and fellow pupils living closely alongside them, and Tudor ideas about rank made disciplining royalty considerably more complicated than disciplining ordinary children. For you, that creates an unusual existence. One moment you might be studying Latin beside a prince. The next, he decides lessons are boring. 5 minutes later, somehow this has become your problem. You quickly develop a powerful interest in the prince's academic success. Please finish your grammar lesson, Your Highness. No. I really think you should. Why? For reasons that are becoming increasingly personal. At least your position can bring advantages. Growing up beside royalty gives you valuable connections and an education unavailable to most Tudor children. You simply have to hope your royal companion develops excellent behaviour. Eventually, though, you leave the palace behind. Your next job comes with considerably less royal privilege, and instead of inspecting a prince's homework, you will be inspecting something much more unsettling. Dead bodies. Because when disease begins moving through Tudor communities, someone has to determine who has died and what may have killed them. After spending your days worrying that a badly behaved prince might earn you a punishment, you decide you would prefer a job where your clients cannot cause trouble. Technically, you succeed. Your clients are dead. You are now performing the kind of work that would eventually become associated with the searchers of the dead. People called upon to examine bodies and report what they believed had caused the death. And when plague or another epidemic is spreading through a crowded community, people suddenly become very interested in your conclusions. Someone has died inside a house. You enter. There are no laboratory tests, protective suits, or modern medical instruments waiting for you. Instead, you inspect the body and look for visible signs that might indicate disease. This is less forensic science and more extremely uncomfortable detective work. You might examine swellings, discoloration, wounds, or other physical clues. You also gather information from relatives or neighbours about how the person became ill. Then a cause of death must somehow be recorded. No pressure. Your work becomes particularly important during outbreaks because authorities want to understand where deaths are occurring. Records of mortality gradually provide communities with a clearer picture of disease moving through neighbourhoods. Of course, there is one fairly obvious occupational problem. If someone has died from an infectious disease, your workplace is precisely the location sensible people are trying to avoid. You enter houses where sickness has already appeared, approach bodies, speak with frightened families, and then move on to another home. Your protective equipment consists largely of Tudor optimism. The work is often associated with women, particularly older women who could earn money performing these examinations. Their judgments were hardly equivalent to those of modern physicians or coroners, and accuracy could vary considerably. Still, somebody had to perform the task. You arrive at a house during an epidemic, and immediately become the person everyone desperately wants information from, while simultaneously wishing you had never needed to visit. Not exactly ideal customer relations. Once your examination is finished, the body can move toward burial, and the death can enter local records. You step outside again, perhaps grateful simply to breathe fresh air. And after spending your working day surrounded by death and disease, you understandably begin searching for another occupation. Something performed outdoors, something where your customers are very much alive. Unfortunately, your next shift begins after sunset, and instead of inspecting dead bodies, you will spend the night removing the substances living Tudor citizens have thrown into their streets and privies. After spending your days inspecting dead bodies, you decide it is time for a profession involving living people again. Good news, you barely have to see them. Your working day begins when everyone else's ends. You are now a nightman, one of the workers responsible for dealing with the less glamorous consequences of urban life after darkness falls. As evening settles over the Tudor town, doors close, candles appear behind windows, and respectable citizens prepare for bed. You prepare to deal with their waste. Perfect. Without modern underground sewage systems, privies and cesspits eventually become full. Household rubbish also accumulates, and removing foul material through busy streets during daylight is neither pleasant nor particularly popular. So some of this work happens at night. You arrive with buckets, shovels, carts, and possibly several colleagues who have made equally questionable career decisions. Your task might involve clearing privies, removing refuse, and transporting unwanted material away from populated areas. The darkness makes the work less disruptive. Unfortunately, it also makes it darker. Tudor streets are not illuminated by neat rows of electric lamps. You work around uneven roads, narrow passages, mud, animals, open drains, and obstacles that become considerably more interesting when you cannot properly see them. One badly placed foot can turn an unpleasant evening into a deeply personal encounter with urban sanitation, and then there is the smell. You are handling substances that have been sitting in confined spaces for quite some time. No amount of positive thinking is going to transform this into fresh country air. But your work matters. Growing towns need people to remove waste. Without workers performing these unpleasant tasks, cesspits overflow, rubbish accumulates, and already questionable streets become even harder to live in. The people sleeping comfortably above you may rarely think about your existence, until you stop coming. Then suddenly everyone becomes very interested in municipal sanitation. By dawn, you have hauled away another night's collection. Residents emerge from their houses and begin their routines, while you disappear from the streets. You are tired, dirty, and probably carrying an aroma capable of announcing your arrival several minutes in advance. Still, you have performed an essential service. Perhaps now you should find work involving something cleaner. Maybe clothing, beautiful Tudor wool, soft fabric, a respectable textile trade. That sounds promising, and it almost is. Until someone explains that your next job as a fuller may involve processing cloth using stale urine. Apparently Tudor England is determined not to let you escape this particular substance. After spending your nights hauling waste through dark Tudor streets, you finally decide to enter a respectable trade. Something clean, something fashionable, something involving beautiful woolen clothing instead of cesspits. You become a fuller, and for approximately 5 minutes, everything seems to be improving. Then someone hands you a container of stale urine. Welcome to the Tudor textile industry. Wool is one of England's most important products, but freshly woven woolen cloth is not automatically ready to become somebody's expensive new coat. It needs further processing to clean the fibres, remove grease and oils, and make the material thicker and more compact. That is where you come in. Fulling involves repeatedly working the cloth while it is wet. Depending on where and when you work, this can involve manual labour or machinery powered by watermills. Earlier methods famously involved workers trampling cloth underfoot. And then there are the cleaning substances. Urine has historically been useful in textile processing because, once allowed to become stale, it produces ammonia that can help remove grease from wool. So while wealthy Tudors admire beautiful fabrics, you get to experience the less fashionable beginning of that process. You handle wet wool, alkaline substances, water, and plenty of unpleasant smells. It is essentially laundry day, except industrial, exhausting, and somehow involving considerably more urine. Still, your work requires judgment. The cloth must be treated properly. Work it incorrectly, and valuable material can be damaged. Process it well, and the fibres tighten together, creating a denser, stronger fabric ready for further finishing. You are therefore an important part of an enormous industry. England's wool and cloth trade support merchants, craftsmen, exporters, labourers, and entire communities. The elegant clothing appearing in Tudor portraits exists because numerous workers like you perform the dirty stages nobody thinks about while admiring the finished result. Henry VIII looks magnificent in expensive fabric. Somewhere a fuller looks at the portrait and thinks, "You have absolutely no idea what I went through for that sleeve." By the end of your shift, you probably smell less like a fashionable textile worker and more like the substance used to clean the textiles. Perhaps it is time for another career change. You want something quieter, something solemn, something where nobody asks you to stand in urine. Your next opportunity involves funerals, which sounds peaceful enough. Unfortunately, Tudor death has its own collection of strange jobs, customs, and professional mourners, and some later traditions become stranger still. After spending your days processing wool with stale urine, you decide you need a profession with a little more dignity. Something solemn, something peaceful, something involving quiet churches and respectful families. You choose funeral work. Surely nothing strange can happen here. Unfortunately, you are still in early modern Britain. Death creates work. Bodies need washing, watching, transporting, preparing and burying. Graves need digging. Bells may need ringing. Families need assistance organising ceremonies, and communities develop elaborate customs surrounding the journey from death to burial. But among the strangest traditions associated with Britain is the mysterious figure later known as the Sin Eater. Here, however, you need to be careful. The classic professional Sin Eater belongs mostly to later folklore and traditions recorded particularly in Wales and western parts of Britain. There is not strong evidence that professional Sin Eaters were a normal occupation across Tudor England. So unfortunately, you cannot confidently add professional eater of sins to your Tudor resume, probably for the best. The later tradition is still wonderfully strange. In some accounts, food and drink are placed near or upon the body of the deceased. A poor person consumes them and symbolically takes upon himself the sins of the dead. Imagine arriving hungry and being offered bread. Excellent. Then someone explains that dessert is eternal guilt. Less excellent. Back in the better documented Tudor world, however, you can still find yourself performing unusual funeral duties. If you are watching a corpse before burial, you may remain nearby for hours. Other workers prepare graves or transport bodies. During periods of epidemic disease, the sheer number of deaths can transform burial from a family ceremony into exhausting daily labour, and beliefs surrounding death make everything more emotionally charged. Religion is central to Tudor life. While the English Reformation repeatedly changes official teachings and funeral practices. During a single lifetime, you might watch England move between different religious expectations about prayers, ceremonies, and what should happen around the dead. Even dying becomes politically complicated. You therefore work in an environment where grief, religion, superstition, and practical necessity constantly overlap. By the time the funeral ends, you decide you would prefer dealing with living creatures again. Preferably something harmless. Then you hear about a position available at the local church. Your responsibility is maintaining order during services. That sounds respectable. You accept immediately. Only afterward does someone hand you a whip and explain that your principal enemies are badly behaved dogs. After spending your time around funerals and dead bodies, you decide you need somewhere peaceful. A church seems perfect. Quiet prayers, gentle candlelight, perhaps the occasional hymn. Finally, you have found a respectable occupation where nothing disgusting, dangerous, or deeply strange can possibly happen. Then a dog runs through the service. Welcome to your new career as a dog whipper. In Tudor and early modern England, churches are not always the perfectly controlled spaces you might imagine today. Dogs can follow their owners inside, wander through open doors, bark during services, fight with other animals, or simply explore the building, because nobody has explained to them that Sunday morning requires better behaviour. Your job is to deal with them. Some churches employ officials responsible for keeping troublesome dogs under control. Depending on local arrangements, you might carry a whip, stick, or even special tongs designed to seize an animal without getting close enough to discover how strongly it objects. You position yourself somewhere inside the church and wait. The congregation settles. The priest begins. Everything is peaceful. Then you hear scratching. A dog appears between the benches. This is your moment. While everyone else attempts to concentrate on salvation, you begin quietly pursuing an animal through the church. Ideally, you remove it without creating more disturbance than the dog itself. That is the theory. In practice, your target may bark, run between people's legs, or decide that being chased is the most exciting thing that has happened all morning. Suddenly the priest is competing for attention with a medieval version of animal control, and your duties might not stop with dogs. Parish officers could perform several small practical tasks connected with maintaining order during worship. In some places, similar officials were responsible for waking parishioners who fell asleep during long sermons, which feels slightly unfair. You spend the entire week working from sunrise to sunset, finally sit somewhere warm and quiet, close your eyes for 3 seconds, and immediately somebody approaches with a stick. Tudor customer service remains impressive. Still, compared with emptying cesspits or collecting leeches with your bare legs, church duty is relatively comfortable. Eventually the service finishes. You put away your equipment and watch the congregation leave. Perhaps working with animals is not so terrible after all. Maybe you could find another occupation involving them. Something outdoors. Something entertaining. Then somebody mentions that the royal court enjoys bear baiting. Soon you are offered work caring for the animals. There is only one minor difference. This time, if your animal becomes difficult, you cannot simply pick it up and carry it outside. After spending your Sundays chasing badly behaved dogs around a church, you decide that perhaps you have a natural talent for working with animals. Then someone offers you a promotion. Instead of handling dogs, you will handle bears. This is the Tudor definition of career progression. You are now a bearward, responsible for keeping and managing bears used in one of Tudor England's most popular blood sports, bear baiting. For spectators, bear baiting is entertainment. For you, it is another day at work with an animal large enough to make disagreements about working conditions extremely brief. Your responsibilities begin long before a crowd arrives. Bears need to be housed, fed, transported, and controlled. You may move them between locations for performances, maintain their enclosures, and help prepare everything necessary for the spectacle. The entertainment itself is brutal. A bear is restrained, commonly by a chain, while dogs are released against it. Spectators gather to watch the confrontation, wager money, shout encouragement, and enjoy what Tudor society considers an excellent afternoon out. Apparently television could not arrive soon enough. Bear baiting attracts people from different levels of society, and even Tudor royalty can enjoy animal spectacles. That makes your occupation more important than simply caring for an unusual animal. You are part of an established entertainment business, but handling the bear remains your problem. You cannot explain that today's performance begins at 3. You cannot politely ask it to cooperate, and you certainly cannot file a complaint when it becomes aggressive. Every interaction demands caution. A frightened or angry bear is immensely powerful, and the chains and barriers separating you from disaster are considerably less reassuring than modern safety equipment. Still, you become familiar with individual animals. You learn their behavior, feeding routines, temperaments, and warning signs. Experience becomes your greatest protection. Eventually the performance ends. The spectators leave discussing the excitement. You remain behind with the bear. Funny how that works. After enough time in the bear garden, you decide that your next job should involve wealthy people instead of dangerous animals. Perhaps royal service again. Better clothing, better food, comfortable rooms. Then you hear that the Tudor court needs people involved in protecting the monarch's meals from possible poisoning. Excellent. Your next occupation involves royal banquets. The only catch is that when everyone becomes suspicious of a particular dish, you may find yourself standing considerably closer to it than the king. After spending your days handling bears, you decide you would like a safer job, preferably indoors, preferably somewhere with excellent food. Somehow, you find yourself at the Tudor royal court, surrounded by roasted meats, pies, wine, spices, sweet dishes, and enormous banquets. Finally, your career choices are improving. Then somebody explains why you are standing between the food and the king. Poison. Now, the popular image of a Tudor food taster is wonderfully dramatic. Every dish arrives, you nervously take a bite. Everyone watches you for 30 seconds, and if you remain upright, Henry VIII begins eating. Reality is more complicated. Tudor monarchs did not necessarily employ one unfortunate servant whose entire occupation was simply tasting every suspicious meal. Instead, royal food passed through carefully controlled kitchens and layers of trusted servants before reaching the monarch. But if you work within that system, security is very much part of your responsibility. You watch who handles the food, you control access. Dishes pass through trusted hands, and certain food or drink might be sampled as part of elaborate precautions surrounding royal service. Because poisoning is something rulers genuinely fear. The Tudor court is filled with political rivalries, diplomatic tensions, religious conflicts, and ambitious people attempting to get close to the monarch. When your king has enemies, even dinner can become a security operation. Imagine someone placing an unfamiliar sauce on the table. Everyone looks at you. You look at the sauce. The sauce offers no explanation. Wonderful. Of course, poisoning is not the constant occurrence Tudor rumours might suggest. Suspicion often travels faster than poison itself. Sudden illness can inspire accusations, especially when physicians have limited ability to determine exactly what caused someone to become sick. That uncertainty encourages elaborate precautions. For you, this means working around some of the finest food in England, while occasionally wondering whether being offered the first bite is actually a compliment. Still, compared with your previous occupations, the surroundings are excellent. No cesspits, no marshes, no bears, and assuming lunch goes well, you even survive until dinner. Eventually, though, you decide you would prefer a profession where consuming questionable substances is not part of the anxiety. Naturally, Tudor England responds by sending you directly to the alehouse. There, your next responsibility will be making sure the local ale is properly made and sold. You are about to become an ale conner. For once, being professionally interested in beer is considered public service. After spending your days wondering whether the king's dinner contains poison, you decide you need a profession where drinking something suspicious carries slightly lower stakes. Tudor England has the perfect job for you. You are now an ale conner. Your responsibility is to help ensure that the ale being sold in your community meets acceptable standards. Ale and beer are important everyday drinks, sold by countless inns, taverns and alehouses, so authorities have a genuine interest in regulating their quality, price and measurement, which means someone has to inspect them. Somehow that someone is you. You visit local establishments and check what is being sold. Measures should be honest. Prices should follow regulations. Brewers and sellers should not simply charge whatever they fancy, while serving customers something that tastes as though it was brewed accidentally behind a stable. Naturally, the part everyone remembers is the tasting. You may have to judge the quality of ale yourself. For perhaps the first time in this journey through Tudor employment, your friends are jealous of your job. Then comes the famous story about your trousers. According to a popular tradition associated with ale conners, you pour some ale onto a wooden bench and sit on it while wearing leather breeches. After waiting for a while, you stand up. If your trousers stick to the bench, the story goes, the ale contains too much sugar or is otherwise considered unsuitable. It is a wonderful image. Unfortunately, historians have good reason to treat this particular method cautiously. The office of ale conner was real, but the sticky trousers test belongs largely to later stories and should not automatically be accepted as standard Tudor quality control, which is slightly disappointing. Still, your genuine responsibilities are strange enough. You are effectively a local alcohol inspector in an age before laboratory testing. Your senses, experience and knowledge of regulations matter. And because ale is consumed so widely, disagreements are inevitable. Tell an alewife that her drink is poor, and you may discover that 16th century customer relations can become surprisingly energetic, but at least nobody is trying to poison you deliberately. Probably. By the end of your rounds, you have inspected measures, considered prices, judged ale, and performed a useful public duty. Now you need only walk home through the Tudor streets. Unfortunately, those streets are covered with mud, animal droppings, market rubbish, household refuse, and whatever somebody has just thrown from an upstairs window. Fortunately, there is a person responsible for dealing with that mess. Unfortunately, for our final strange Tudor job, that person is once again you. After inspecting ale for a living, you finally decide to walk home and enjoy a peaceful evening. Unfortunately, you look down. Welcome to the Tudor street. Mud surrounds your shoes. Horses have left contributions of their own. Market traders have discarded spoiled vegetables and scraps. Workshops produce rubbish. Household waste appears outside buildings, and somewhere nearby somebody is treating the street as though it were one enormous communal bin. Fortunately, Tudor towns have officials responsible for dealing with this problem. Unfortunately, you are now one of them. You are a scavenger. The Tudor scavenger is rather different from the modern idea of someone searching through rubbish for useful objects. The term could refer to local officials responsible for overseeing street cleanliness and helping organise the removal of refuse. And there is plenty to oversee. You walk through your assigned area, checking streets, lanes, and public spaces. Residents and businesses are expected to follow local rules concerning rubbish, although convincing everyone to cooperate is another matter entirely. Apparently, people ignoring municipal regulations is not a modern invention. Markets create particularly impressive quantities of waste. Imagine vegetable leaves, rotten food, straw, broken containers, animal droppings, ashes, mud, and discarded material gradually accumulating beneath hundreds of feet. Then it rains. Everything combines. You now have Tudor soup. Your responsibility may include ensuring that householders clean areas around their properties and that accumulated refuse is collected and removed. Actual labourers and carts can carry waste away, while officials supervise the process and enforce local requirements. It is not glamorous work, but it is essential. Growing towns such as London cannot function indefinitely if everyone simply throws unwanted material into public spaces. Streets need to remain passable, markets need to operate, and mountains of rubbish eventually have to disappear. You therefore become part sanitation officer, part inspector, and part professional reminder that no, the middle of the road is not an acceptable permanent location for yesterday's kitchen waste. By evening, you look across the street you have helped clear, and after 15 strange Tudor occupations, you have finally reached the end of your career journey. You have attended the king's toilet, emptied cesspits, hunted rats, collected leeches, performed executions, inspected corpses, chased dogs through churches, handled bears, worried about poisoned dinners, tested ale, and supervised Tudor rubbish. Suddenly your real job tomorrow morning seems remarkably civilized. When you imagine an ancient Egyptian mummy, you probably picture linen wrappings, golden masks, elaborate coffins, and perhaps a slightly uncomfortable reminder that someone has been lying there for several thousand years. What you probably do not imagine is finding tattoos beneath those wrappings. And yet, that is exactly what archaeologists have discovered. Some ancient Egyptian mummies preserve markings that were deliberately placed into the skin while the person was alive. They include dots, lines, geometric arrangements, and, in some remarkable cases, recognizable images. Because mummification preserved the body so effectively, these tattoos survived long after the people who created them, their families, and even many of their temples had disappeared. For archaeologists, this creates an unusual problem. A painted wall can sometimes be accompanied by hieroglyphs explaining what is happening. A coffin might identify its owner. A papyrus can provide names, prayers, instructions, and beliefs. A tattoo offers no convenient caption saying, "Here is why I put this on my body." So researchers have had to investigate the markings almost like detectives. One of the most famous tattooed Egyptian mummies is a naturally preserved man from Gebelein who lived more than 5,000 years ago. For many years, dark marks on his arm were not fully understood. Modern infrared imaging eventually revealed something extraordinary. They appeared to represent two horned animals. Suddenly, what looked like discoloration became evidence of deliberate body art, and he was not alone. Other Egyptian mummies, particularly women from later periods, have been found with patterns of dots and symbols across areas such as the abdomen, thighs, arms, shoulders, and back. Some markings appear simple. Others form carefully arranged designs that would have required considerable patience to create, which raises the obvious question, why endure the process? Ancient tattooing was hardly a relaxing afternoon appointment. Pigment had to be introduced beneath the skin using sharp instruments, presumably without anyone offering you a comfortable chair and asking what music you wanted. The answer may lie in religion, protection, fertility, status, healing, or perhaps several purposes at once. But before we can understand what these tattoos meant, we first need to understand who was wearing them, and that makes the story considerably stranger. Once archaeologists realized that ancient Egyptians really were tattooing their bodies, another mystery appeared almost immediately. Who exactly was getting these tattoos? For a long time, the evidence seemed surprisingly one-sided. Many of the best-known tattooed Egyptian mummies were women. This encouraged early researchers to suggest that tattooing might have been associated primarily with female life. Some proposed connections with dancers, musicians, servants, or women involved in religious activities. Others connected the markings with sexuality and fertility. The problem is that archaeology has an annoying habit of ruining perfectly tidy explanations. The discovery of tattooed male mummies complicated the picture considerably. The naturally mummified man from Gebelein, for example, carried images of horned animals on his upper arm. That pushed Egyptian tattooing back more than 5,000 years and demonstrated that body marking was certainly not something practiced exclusively by women. Still, female mummies provide some of the richest evidence. Several women discovered at Deir el-Medina, the settlement inhabited by workers who built royal tombs, carried extensive tattoos. Their markings were far more elaborate than a few decorative dots. Some covered the neck, shoulders, arms, and back with repeated symbols and images. This suggests that at least certain tattoos were meant to be visible. Imagine walking through an Egyptian settlement wearing designs that everyone around you could recognize, while modern archaeologists stare at them thousands of years later, thinking, essentially, well, this obviously meant something. The frustrating part is determining exactly what. Some tattooed women may have held religious roles. Their markings include symbols associated with divine protection, which raises the possibility that tattoos could advertise devotion to particular gods or identify someone involved in ritual activity. But we should be careful. Having tattoos does not automatically tell us someone's profession, social status, or personality. Ancient Egyptians inconveniently failed to leave behind a helpful handbook titled "What Your Tattoo Says About You." What the surviving bodies do reveal is diversity. Egyptian tattooing stretched across enormous periods of time, appeared on both men and women, and included everything from simple geometric patterns to recognizable animals and religious imagery. And once researchers began examining the actual designs, rather than simply asking who wore them, another possibility emerged. These marks may not have been decoration at all. Some may have been placed on the body because ancient Egyptians believed they could actually protect the person wearing them. If some ancient Egyptian tattoos were not simply decoration, then what were they supposed to do? One intriguing possibility is that they were meant to protect the person wearing them. To understand why, you have to enter an Egyptian world in which religion was not something confined to temples. Divine forces surrounded everyday life. Illness, childbirth, dangerous animals, death, and the uncertainty of the afterlife could all involve supernatural powers. Protection, therefore, came in many forms: amulets, prayers, magical texts, images, and rituals. A tattoo may have offered something particularly useful. You could not lose it. An amulet might break. A necklace could disappear. A protective tattoo, however, became part of your body. Wherever you went, the symbol went with you, which was rather convenient in a civilization where invisible dangers apparently refused to respect personal space. Some tattooed Egyptian women carried images associated with protective deities. Particularly fascinating are tattoos connected with Bez, a deity recognizable by his unusual appearance and strongly associated with protection, especially around women, children, childbirth, music, and the household. Other discovered designs include the Eye of Horus, sometimes called the Wedjat Eye, another powerful symbol of protection, restoration, and well-being. Their placement may also have mattered. Researchers have found tattoos positioned around areas including the neck, shoulders, arms, lower back, abdomen, and thighs. Rather than being randomly scattered, some designs appear carefully arranged across the body. That raises the possibility that particular symbols protected particular areas or became visible during certain activities. Imagine the body itself becoming something like a permanent collection of amulets. Instead of hanging protection around your neck, you carried it directly beneath your skin. Of course, we cannot ask the tattooed individuals what they believed their markings accomplished. There is no surviving ancient Egyptian tattoo catalogue explaining that 3 dots cost extra and the protective goddess package was available on Tuesdays. So interpretation requires caution. Not every tattoo necessarily had a magical purpose. Some could have indicated identity, devotion, status, beauty, or personal preference. Different people living centuries apart may have tattooed themselves for completely different reasons. But religious imagery strongly suggests that at least some markings carried meanings beyond appearance. And nowhere would protection have been more valuable than during one of the most dangerous experiences an ancient Egyptian woman could face: childbirth. That possibility leads us to some of the strangest tattoo patterns found on Egyptian women, and to the theory that certain tattoos may have been connected with fertility, pregnancy, and keeping both mother and child alive. If ancient Egyptian tattoos could offer protection, there was one moment when protection would have been especially welcome: childbirth. Giving birth in the ancient world was dangerous. There were no modern hospitals, antibiotics, blood transfusions, or emergency surgery waiting nearby. Pregnancy could therefore be surrounded by religious rituals, protective objects, prayers and symbols intended to guard both mother and child. This is where some Egyptian tattoos become particularly interesting. Several tattooed female mummies display patterns around the abdomen, hips, thighs, and lower torso. Early researchers noticed that these locations were closely associated with pregnancy and childbirth. leading to the theory that certain tattoos might have functioned as protective symbols for women. Some designs consisted of repeated dots arranged into geometric patterns. When placed across the abdomen, such patterns would naturally change as the body changed during pregnancy. Researchers have suggested that this might have been intentional, although exactly what the expanding pattern meant remains uncertain. Ancient Egyptians also relied upon protective deities connected with childbirth. One of the most important was Bes, the distinctive protective figure we encountered earlier. Bes guarded households, mothers and children, and was associated with music, dancing, sexuality, and childbirth. Images of Bes appear in Egyptian domestic and religious contexts, making his appearance in tattoo traditions especially suggestive. Another protective figure was Taweret, usually represented as a formidable combination of hippopotamus, crocodile, lion, and human characteristics. Not exactly the creature you would choose for a nursery decoration today. For Egyptians, however, her frightening appearance was part of the point. Dangerous supernatural forces apparently deserved an equally intimidating opponent. This does not mean every tattoo found near a woman's abdomen was automatically a fertility charm. Earlier interpretations sometimes treated tattooed women almost entirely through the lens of sexuality or reproduction. Modern researchers are considerably more cautious. A woman could have been a mother, religious practitioner, musician, craft worker, or several of these things during her lifetime. Her tattoos might likewise have carried several meanings. What seems increasingly clear is that tattoo placement mattered. These markings were attached permanently to specific parts of the body, potentially transforming the skin into a surface for protection and religious identity. And some Egyptian women took this much further than a few dots around the abdomen. Their bodies were covered with dozens of intricate symbols. When archaeologists discovered one particularly heavily tattooed woman, they realized they were looking at something far more elaborate than simple decoration. Some ancient Egyptian tattoos were subtle, a few dots, perhaps a small pattern placed on one part of the body. Then archaeologists encountered something much more extraordinary. At Deir el-Medina, the village occupied by the craftsmen who constructed and decorated royal tombs near Thebes, researchers examined the remains of a woman who had lived more than 3,000 years ago. Her mummy was incomplete, but enough skin survived to reveal something remarkable. She had been extensively tattooed. Dozens of designs appeared across her body, including her arms, shoulders, back, and neck. These were not simply random collections of dots. Researchers identified recognizable religious symbols, including representations connected with divine protection. Among the most striking were several Wedjat eyes, better known today as the Eyes of Horus. In Egyptian religion, the Wedjat represented ideas including healing, restoration, protection, and completeness. Egyptians wore the symbol as an amulet, placed it on objects, and incorporated it into funerary traditions. This woman apparently carried versions of it permanently on her skin. Even more fascinating was their placement. Some tattoos were positioned around areas of the body where they could have remained visible to people standing around her. Researchers have therefore suggested that her tattoos might have played an active role during religious ceremonies. Imagine her extending her arms during a ritual. The symbols would move with her. Suddenly, the tattoo was not merely an image. The human body itself became part of the religious performance. Other markings found on tattooed Egyptian women have been associated with deities such as Hathor, goddess of music, motherhood, sexuality, joy, and feminine power. This has encouraged researchers to consider whether heavily tattooed women may sometimes have served particular religious functions. But there is still plenty we do not know. We cannot confidently give every tattooed individual a precise title, nor can we assume that everyone displaying similar symbols performed exactly the same role. Ancient Egyptian society lasted for thousands of years. Tattoo traditions could change enormously during that time. Still, discoveries like the woman from Deir el-Medina transformed the way scholars thought about Egyptian tattooing. These were not necessarily small decorative marks hidden beneath clothing. Some people carried complicated collections of sacred imagery across highly visible parts of their bodies, and remarkably, scientists are still discovering tattoos that previous generations of archaeologists completely missed. The reason is simple. After thousands of years, ancient tattoos do not always look like tattoos anymore. For thousands of years, some Egyptian tattoos were sitting in plain sight. The problem was that nobody could properly see them. When skin is mummified, it changes dramatically. It dries, darkens, wrinkles, and becomes discoloured. A tattoo that might once have been clearly visible on living skin can eventually resemble an ordinary stain or patch of pigmentation. This means early archaeologists could examine a mummy without realising they were looking directly at ancient body art. Modern imaging technology changed that. One of the most useful techniques has been infrared photography. Infrared imaging can reveal differences between tattoo pigment and the surrounding mummified skin that are extremely difficult to distinguish with the naked eye. Suddenly, vague dark patches become recognisable designs. The famous Gebelein male mummy provides a perfect example. The man lived more than 5,000 years ago and was naturally preserved in the dry Egyptian environment. Dark marks had long been visible on his upper arm, but their significance was unclear. Infrared examination revealed recognisable shapes. One appears to represent a wild bull, while another resembles a Barbary sheep. That discovery was extraordinary because it demonstrated that figurative tattooing existed in ancient Egypt remarkably early. These were not simply dots or lines. Someone had deliberately placed recognisable animals onto another person's skin thousands of years before the pyramids of Giza reached their famous form. And apparently, the tattoo artist was already ambitious. No starting with a discreet little dot somewhere easily hidden. Straight to horned animals. Technology has also helped researchers examine tattooed female mummies more carefully. Infrared photography can expose patterns across shoulders, arms, backs, and other areas where ordinary visual inspection might reveal very little. This raises an exciting possibility. Museums around the world contain Egyptian human remains excavated decades, or even more than a century ago. Some may carry tattoos that have never been properly identified. The number of known tattooed Egyptians could therefore increase as researchers revisit old collections using newer techniques. But technology can only reveal the image. It cannot automatically reveal the meaning. Infrared photography might show an eye, animal, flower, geometric arrangement, or religious symbol with remarkable clarity. It cannot tell us why that particular person chose it, what ceremony accompanied its creation, or what emotions they associated with it. For those answers, researchers must combine the tattoos with archaeology, Egyptian religion, art, and the locations where the bodies were discovered. And that brings us to the final mystery. How were these tattoos actually made? Finding an ancient tattoo is impressive. Understanding how someone created it thousands of years ago is considerably harder. Ancient Egyptians left us paintings showing farming, cooking, weaving, hunting, and countless other activities. Unfortunately, nobody seems to have thought future historians desperately needed a convenient illustration titled, "Here is exactly how we tattoo people." So researchers have had to reconstruct the process from physical evidence. Tattooing requires pigment to be introduced beneath the surface of the skin. Simply painting a design onto someone would eventually disappear. To make the marking permanent, the skin had to be repeatedly punctured while pigment was applied. The process was probably simple in principle and unpleasant in practice. Archaeologists have discovered groups of sharp metal implements that have sometimes been proposed as possible tattooing tools. Several fine points could potentially puncture the skin repeatedly, allowing dark pigment to enter the tiny wounds. Whether every object identified this way was actually used for tattooing remains uncertain, but the tattoos themselves leave no doubt that ancient practitioners developed effective techniques. The earliest Egyptian designs could be surprisingly sophisticated. The figurative animals discovered on the Gebelein man required someone to create recognizable outlines on human skin. Later tattooed individuals display repeated symbols and carefully arranged patterns across substantial areas of the body. Who performed this work remains mysterious. Perhaps tattooing was carried out by specialists. Perhaps religious practitioners created particular sacred designs. Perhaps knowledge was passed between generations within certain communities. We simply do not have an ancient Egyptian tattoo artist introducing themselves in a surviving papyrus. What we do have is their work. And that work survived something its creators could never have imagined. The person died. Their world disappeared. Languages changed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Temples collapsed into ruins. Eventually, archaeologists uncovered the body, scientists photographed the skin, and marks created by an unknown hand thousands of years ago became visible again. That may be the most fascinating thing about Egyptian tattoos. They remind us that ancient Egyptians did not experience their bodies only as something to preserve after death. While alive, some chose to permanently alter their appearance, carrying animals, dots, protective eyes, and sacred symbols directly on their skin. We may never know exactly what every design meant, but perhaps that uncertainty is appropriate. After all, tattoos today can represent religion, grief, family, beauty, identity, memory, or simply something someone thought looked good. 5,000 years ago, human beings may not have been quite so different. Becoming a druid was not simply a matter of walking into a sacred grove, putting on a robe, and announcing that trees suddenly seemed very important to you. According to ancient writers, becoming part of the learned religious class among Celtic peoples could require years of education. Julius Caesar, one of our most famous sources on the Druids of Gaul, claimed that some students spent as long as 20 years in training. That is an extraordinary commitment. A young student entering this world would not merely be learning how to conduct ceremonies. Druids were described as religious authorities, teachers, judges, advisors, and guardians of traditional knowledge. Their influence could extend into disputes, religious observances, and questions concerning the community itself. But there is an immediate problem when trying to reconstruct their education. The Druids themselves left us almost nothing written explaining it. Most detailed descriptions come from Greek and Roman authors looking at Celtic society from the outside. Some were better informed than others, and Roman writers certainly had their own political and cultural biases. So the popular image of the Druid must always be treated cautiously. Still, one detail appears particularly fascinating: memorization. Caesar claimed that Druidic students learned enormous amounts of material by heart, and that their teachings were generally not committed to writing, even though writing was used for other purposes. Imagine what that meant for an apprentice. There was no convenient textbook sitting beside you, no notebook containing everything the teacher said yesterday, no quick glance at your notes because you had forgotten the middle section. Your memory was the library. Students may have learned religious teachings, traditions concerning the gods, rules governing ritual, ideas about the natural world, and knowledge connected with law and social custom. Caesar also described Druids discussing subjects such as the stars, the movements of heavenly bodies, the nature of the world, and divine matters. So becoming a Druid appears to have involved intellectual discipline as much as religious training, and this helps explain why Druids could command such respect. Knowledge was power precisely because knowledge was difficult to acquire. If training really could last many years, becoming a Druid was less like accepting a religious job and more like entering an educational system that consumed a substantial portion of your youth. But before you could memorize decades of sacred knowledge, someone first had to teach you. And that raises the next question. Where did Druidic students actually go to learn? Once you entered Druidic training, one of your greatest challenges may have been surprisingly simple. You had to remember everything. According to Julius Caesar, Druids considered it inappropriate to commit their teachings to writing, even though Celtic communities were perfectly capable of using written language for other purposes. He noted that the Gauls sometimes used Greek letters in ordinary affairs, so this was apparently a deliberate choice. Sacred knowledge belonged in the memory. For a student, that meant education could involve enormous amounts of oral instruction. You listened to your teachers, repeated what you had learned, and gradually committed traditions to memory. There was no ancient Celtic equivalent of quietly checking your notes beneath the table. Forget an important passage, and the solution was presumably to learn it again. Caesar claimed that some Druidic students remained in training for 20 years, partly because of the sheer quantity of material they were expected to memorize. We should remember that this description comes from a Roman outsider, but it gives us a fascinating picture of Druidic education. Their studies apparently went well beyond ceremonies. Caesar described Druids as discussing the stars and their movements, the size of the universe and the earth, the nature of things and the powers of the immortal gods. They were therefore presented not simply as priests, but as members of an educated intellectual class. Religion, law, astronomy, philosophy, and traditional knowledge could overlap. Another important teaching concerned the soul. Caesar reported that Druids taught that the soul did not perish, but passed after death from one person to another. He believed this teaching encouraged bravery because it reduced the fear of death. Whether Caesar perfectly understood Druidic belief is impossible to know. That uncertainty follows us everywhere. Because the Druids did not leave behind their own surviving training manuals, we cannot reconstruct a normal day of lessons or produce a precise curriculum. We do not know exactly how students were examined, how teachers organized their material, or what marked the completion of each stage. What we can see is the importance placed on learning. A respected Druid was expected to carry an enormous body of inherited knowledge without depending upon written texts. That made education intensely personal. Knowledge passed from teacher to student, generation after generation. And once a student had absorbed that tradition, learning alone was not enough. A Druid also had to understand how that knowledge applied to the disputes, judgments, and decisions of everyday Celtic society. Knowing religious traditions was only part of becoming a Druid. If ancient Roman descriptions are broadly accurate, you also had to understand something far more likely to ruin a peaceful afternoon. Other people's arguments. Druids were described as important authorities in disputes among the Gauls. Julius Caesar wrote that they dealt with both public and private disagreements, including serious matters such as crimes, inheritance, and disputes over boundaries. In other words, imagine two neighbours arguing over where one field ends and another begins. Eventually, someone may have needed a Druid. This meant Druidic education was not simply about memorizing sacred teachings. A future Druid needed knowledge of customs, precedents, obligations, and whatever traditional principles governed relationships within the community. And judgments carried weight. Caesar claimed that people who refused to accept druidic decisions could be excluded from religious sacrifices. He presented this as a severe punishment because those affected could become socially isolated and treated as impious. That gave druids considerable authority. You were not simply advising people on what seemed fair. Your religious position could reinforce your judgment. The combination is important because modern categories like priest, lawyer, philosopher, and teacher do not fit neatly onto ancient Celtic society. Druids appear in Greco-Roman descriptions performing functions that cross several of these roles. For an apprentice, learning how to judge disputes may therefore have been an essential part of becoming respected. But exactly how this legal education worked is unknown. We do not possess a druidic law textbook. We cannot watch an apprentice sitting beside an experienced druid while someone complains that a neighbouring farmer has moved a boundary stone suspiciously closer during the night. Still, oral education provides one possibility. Students could learn rules and traditions through memorized teachings, stories, examples, and explanations passed down by experienced instructors. Years of training would give them time not merely to memorize information, but to understand how it applied to real situations. And that experience mattered. A druid's authority depended partly on other people accepting that he possessed knowledge they did not. By the end of training, you were expected to remember traditions, understand religious matters, and potentially help settle conflicts that could affect families and entire communities. But judging arguments was still only one side of druidic life. Eventually, the apprentice had to move from learning sacred traditions to participating in sacred practice itself. And this is where we enter the most famous and most controversial part of the druidic world: their rituals. Eventually, a druid's education had to move beyond memorization and judgment. You also had to learn how to deal with the gods. Ancient writers consistently associated druids with religious ceremonies, sacrifices, sacred places, and interpreting divine matters. For an apprentice, this presumably meant learning not only what the community believed, but how those beliefs were expressed through ritual. Unfortunately, this is where our evidence becomes especially difficult. Almost everything we know about druidic ceremonies comes from Greek and Roman observers, some of whom were writing about peoples Rome was actively fighting or conquering. Their descriptions can therefore be dramatic, hostile, and impossible to verify in every detail. Still, certain patterns emerge. Druids were associated with sacrifices and important religious gatherings. A trainee would presumably need to understand when ceremonies should take place, what offerings were appropriate, which traditions had to be followed, and how sacred occasions were conducted. Mistakes were probably not ideal. Forgetting part of a sacred ritual is awkward enough when your entire professional reputation is based on remembering things. Nature also seems to have held important religious significance. Roman authors famously connected druids with sacred groves. Pliny the Elder described a particularly elaborate ceremony involving mistletoe growing on an oak tree. In his account, a druid dressed in white climbed the tree and cut the mistletoe using a golden sickle. The plant was caught in a white cloak rather than allowed to touch the ground, while animals were sacrificed as part of the ceremony. It is one of history's most famous images of druidism. It is also one we should treat carefully. Pliny was describing what he believed about Gallic religious practice, not providing us with a druid written instruction manual. We cannot assume every druid across the Celtic world performed identical ceremonies. Even the term Celtic religion covers communities separated by geography and time. But ritual expertise clearly mattered. Becoming a druid meant entering a tradition where religious knowledge could give you authority over ceremonies connecting the human community, with the supernatural world. Years of training may therefore have included observing experienced druids, learning sacred formulas, remembering traditions, and eventually taking on greater ritual responsibilities. And some Roman accounts describe ceremonies far darker than cutting mistletoe. They claimed druids sometimes participated in human sacrifice. Whether those descriptions were accurate, exaggerated, or shaped by Roman propaganda remains heavily debated. But for anyone trying to understand how a druid was trained, they lead directly into the most controversial part of the story. If you were training to become a druid, religious ceremonies may have eventually become part of your responsibilities. But according to Roman writers, some of those ceremonies could become extremely dark. Julius Caesar famously claimed that certain Gauls practiced human sacrifice, and that druids were involved in overseeing these rituals. His most memorable description concerns enormous figures, supposedly constructed from woven branches. People were placed inside. Then the structure was burned. This account helped create the famous image of the Wicker Man, which has followed the Druids into popular culture ever since. There is, however, an enormous problem. Caesar was not a neutral anthropologist visiting Gaul with a notebook and an interest in cultural exchange. He was the Roman general conquering it. Describing your enemies as people who burn humans inside giant wooden figures is rather convenient when explaining why your armies are invading them. Other ancient writers also connected Celtic religious practices with human sacrifice, so Caesar was not alone. Archaeology has uncovered human remains in ritual-looking contexts in parts of Iron Age Europe and Britain as well. But connecting individual discoveries directly to druids is much harder. The famous Lindo man, discovered preserved in an English peat bog, is a good example. His unusual death has encouraged theories involving ritual killing, but we cannot confidently say that druids killed him, or even reconstruct exactly why he died. That uncertainty matters. We know far less about actual druidic ritual than popular culture sometimes suggests. A student training under a druid might have learned sacrificial traditions involving animals, offerings, sacred places, prayers, seasonal ceremonies, and methods of interpreting religious signs. Whether human sacrifice formed a regular part of that training is something the surviving evidence simply cannot establish with confidence. And there was probably enormous regional variation. A druid in Gaul did not necessarily practice religion exactly like a religious specialist in Britain or Ireland. These communities were separated by distance, political traditions, and centuries of change. So the image of one standardized druid handbook being distributed across Celtic Europe should probably be abandoned. What seems more important is that ritual knowledge was specialized. An apprentice gradually learned traditions ordinary members of the community may not have possessed. That knowledge helped transform him from student into religious authority, but ceremonies alone still did not make someone influential. The most respected druids could operate close to the centers of political power. And sometimes, even warriors and rulers were expected to listen when a druid spoke. After years of memorizing traditions, studying religious matters, learning customary law, and participating in ceremonies, a druid could become something much more influential than a village priest. He could become someone powerful people listened to. Ancient writers describe druids as holding considerable social authority among Celtic communities. Their influence appears to have reached beyond religion into politics, diplomacy, law, and decisions affecting entire groups. For an aspiring druid, this meant another important skill had to be developed. You needed to speak with authority. In societies where much important knowledge was transmitted orally, the ability to remember information was only half the challenge. You also had to communicate it convincingly. A respected druid might be expected to explain traditions, deliver judgments, advise leaders, teach students, and speak during important gatherings. There was no hiding quietly behind your collection of sacred books. You did not have any. Classical writers sometimes portrayed Celtic religious specialists as capable of intervening in conflicts. Later traditions, particularly those preserved in medieval Irish literature, also present learned religious and poetic figures interacting closely with kings, although these texts were written centuries after the pre-Christian Druidic world and cannot simply be treated as eyewitness evidence. Still, the broader picture is revealing. Knowledge gave Druids status. A ruler might command warriors, land, and wealth, but a Druid represented another form of power, inherited learning, religious legitimacy, and familiarity with customs believed to govern both human society and its relationship with the supernatural. That could make Druids valuable advisors. It could also make them politically inconvenient. Roman authorities eventually moved against Druidic institutions in areas under their control. Roman writers associated Druids with resistance and with religious practices Rome condemned. The famous Roman attack on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey, was described by Tacitus as targeting an important centre connected with Druids. By then, Druidic authority had clearly attracted Roman attention. For the apprentice who had spent years training, however, reaching this level represented an extraordinary transformation. You had begun as someone expected to listen and memorize. Now others were expected to listen to you. But there was probably no single graduation ceremony that suddenly transformed a student into a fully respected druid, at least none that our surviving sources reliably describe. Instead, status may have grown through knowledge, experience, reputation, and recognition. And after perhaps many years of preparation, the apprentice could finally become the teacher. After years of training, memorization, ritual practice, and learning how to settle disputes, the apprentice had reached the final stage of becoming a druid. But there was probably no graduation day. No surviving ancient source describes young druids gathering beneath an oak tree while an elderly teacher hands them certificates and congratulates them on surviving 20 years without textbooks. Instead, becoming a respected druid was probably gradual. Your authority came from what you knew, what you could remember, and whether other people recognized your ability to use that knowledge. According to Julius Caesar, druids enjoyed considerable prestige. They were exempt from military service and certain obligations, privileges that apparently encouraged many young men to enter their training voluntarily, while others were sent by their families. But those privileges came after an extraordinary educational commitment. Caesar claimed some students spent 20 years studying. During that time, they could memorize large amounts of traditional teaching concerning religion, divine matters, the natural world, and the heavens. Eventually, experienced druids could become teachers themselves, and this was crucial. If important teachings were deliberately preserved orally rather than written down, every generation depended upon the previous one. A knowledgeable druid was therefore more than someone who possessed information. He was part of the mechanism keeping that information alive. Imagine spending decades building a library inside your memory, only to discover that retirement involved teaching someone else the entire library. Druids also appear to have had their own hierarchy. Caesar described one druid holding supreme authority over the others. When this leader died, another could succeed him based on distinction, although Caesar claimed that competing candidates could sometimes struggle over the position. So even among druids, prestige was not necessarily equal. Reputation mattered. By the time someone became a senior religious figure, he might serve as teacher, judge, ritual specialist, advisor, and guardian of inherited traditions. Yet much about this final transition remains unknown. We do not know whether there was a formal initiation marking full membership. We do not know precisely how apprentices demonstrated that their education was complete. And because surviving descriptions were largely written by outsiders, we should resist pretending that we can reconstruct a standardized druid career perfectly. What we can see is the scale of commitment involved. Becoming a druid was not simply learning a collection of mysterious ceremonies. It meant becoming one of the people trusted to remember what everyone else could afford to forget. And in an oral society, that made memory itself a form of power. Before modern chemistry could tell you what was hiding in your dinner, detecting poison was largely a mixture of observation, superstition, expensive objects, and nervous guessing. For powerful people, this could make eating surprisingly stressful. Kings, nobles, wealthy merchants, and political figures sometimes lived in societies where poisoning was considered a believable method of assassination. A suspicious illness after dinner could immediately produce whispers. Was it spoiled meat, disease, too much wine, or had somebody quietly added something unpleasant to the sauce? The problem was that many poisons were difficult to identify reliably. There were no laboratory tests waiting in the next room. No toxicology report would arrive tomorrow morning. People instead searched for physical signs. A strange smell, unusual colour, unexpected sediment, or suspicious taste might cause alarm. Unfortunately, tasting the suspicious food was itself a rather questionable diagnostic technique, so people looked for safer methods. Across medieval and early modern courts, elaborate precautions developed around eating and drinking. Food could be watched during preparation. Servants might control access to kitchens. Dishes could be inspected before reaching an important person. In particularly nervous households, someone else might taste the food first. This is where the famous image of the royal food taster comes from. It sounds sensible until you consider the practical problem. Not every poison acted immediately. A taster could swallow something, stand there looking perfectly healthy, and provide everyone with tremendous confidence for approximately the wrong reasons. Still, when reliable scientific detection did not exist, reassurance had value. And humans became wonderfully creative at manufacturing reassurance. People believed certain cups, stones, animal parts, and precious materials could reveal or neutralize poison. Some objects supposedly changed color when poison approached. Others were believed to sweat, crack, or react mysteriously. The wealthier you were, the more elaborate your protection could become, which was convenient, because nothing says personal security quite like purchasing an extremely expensive gemstone and hoping it dislikes arsenic. Yet these beliefs were not simply foolishness. They developed in a world where poisoning was poorly understood and where people were desperately trying to create rules for an invisible threat. And among all these supposed defences, one became especially famous. It was already sitting on the dinner table. Silver. For centuries, silver enjoyed an unusually impressive reputation at the dinner table. It was beautiful, expensive, associated with wealth, and according to popular belief, potentially capable of warning you that someone had poisoned your meal. The idea was simple enough. If poisoned food or drink touched silver, the metal was supposedly capable of reacting. A spoon might darken, a cup might discolor, something unusual would happen, giving the diner enough warning to politely stop eating before collapsing into the soup. There was just one rather important problem. Silver was not a reliable poison detector. Silver can tarnish when exposed to certain sulfur-containing substances. That means some foods, environmental conditions, or compounds could cause visible changes, but many dangerous poisons would produce no useful reaction at all, so your spoon might remain beautifully shiny while your dinner remained considerably less reassuring. Yet the belief survived. Part of the reason was probably that silver already represented status and purity. Wealthy households used silver vessels, plates, and utensils, so it was easy to imagine that these valuable objects provided practical protection as well. And when something occasionally did cause the metal to darken, the reaction could appear to confirm the belief. Imagine seeing your silver spoon change colour during a suspicious meal. You would probably remember that experience. The hundreds of perfectly harmless meals where nothing happened would be considerably less memorable. This was the difficulty with poison detection before scientific testing. People were working from patterns they could observe, stories they had heard, and traditions passed down through generations. If a method seemed to work once, it could gain an impressive reputation, and when assassination was the fear, even unreliable protection could feel preferable to none. Silverware therefore became part of a much larger culture of defensive dining. Important people might combine expensive utensils with trusted servants, controlled kitchens, food tasters, and careful observation. Essentially, dinner became a security operation with bread, but silver was only the beginning. If a piece of metal could supposedly expose poison, people reasoned that perhaps other rare materials possessed even greater powers. Soon wealthy Europeans were collecting objects believed capable not merely of detecting poison, but sometimes neutralizing it altogether. Precious stones entered the dining room. Strange animal parts appeared beside drinking vessels. Exotic objects were transformed into supposed anti-poison devices. And among the richest households, protection from poisoning could become almost as elaborate as the meal itself. If silverware seemed too ordinary for detecting poison, wealthy people had another option. They could trust gemstones. During the medieval and early modern periods, precious stones were often believed to possess properties far beyond looking attractive on a ring. Certain gems were associated with healing, protection, purity, or the ability to resist dangerous substances. In a world where medicine, religion, folklore, and natural philosophy frequently overlapped, the idea was not necessarily considered ridiculous. A gemstone could be jewelry and emergency medical equipment at the same time. Emeralds developed particularly impressive reputations. Some writers claimed that emeralds could resist poison or reveal its presence. Other stones, including sapphires, rubies, and amethysts, accumulated their own supposed protective qualities. Exactly what they were expected to do varied enormously. Some traditions suggested that a stone might change color near poison. Others claimed it could lose its brightness, become damaged, or somehow react when danger approached. There was an obvious attraction to this idea. Instead of finding a volunteer to taste your suspicious wine, you could simply consult your jewelry. Unfortunately, gemstones are considerably better at being gemstones than toxicologists. Still, belief in protective stones could become elaborate. Wealthy individuals sometimes wore them on rings or incorporated them into drinking vessels and other objects. The rarity of the material probably helped strengthen its reputation. If something had travelled enormous distances and cost a small fortune, surely it ought to do more than sparkle. People also valued objects believed to come from unusual animals. One particularly famous example was the so-called bezoar stone, a hardened mass that can form inside the digestive systems of certain animals. Bezoars became highly prized in Europe because they were believed to neutralize poison. A wealthy household might drop one into a drink or use a special container incorporating the material. To modernize, placing an animal stomach stone into your wine may seem like the moment dinner has gone slightly off course, but bezoars could be extraordinarily valuable. Their reputation became so powerful that rulers and nobles collected them alongside precious treasures. Some were mounted in gold and transformed into magnificent objects. And bezoars were only part of the strange anti-poison marketplace. Another object became so valuable that Europeans paid enormous sums for it, believing it could detect poison simply by touching food. The remarkable part? Many buyers thought they were purchasing unicorn horn. If gemstones and bezoars were not reassuring enough, wealthy Europeans could turn to something even more impressive: unicorn horn. At least that was what they thought they were buying. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, objects sold as unicorn horns became highly prized in European courts. The long spiraled pieces were believed to possess extraordinary powers, including the ability to detect or neutralize poison. There was one small zoological complication. Most were actually narwhal tusks. Narwhals lived in Arctic waters far beyond the everyday experience of most Europeans. Their remarkable spiral tusks entered European trade networks without most buyers having any realistic idea where they came from. And if someone told you this mysterious object belonged to a legendary horse with magical poison-fighting abilities, verifying the claim was difficult, especially without internet access. Pieces of supposed unicorn horn could be made into cups, incorporated into tableware, or kept among royal treasures. In some traditions, the material was believed to react when placed near poisoned food or drink. Powder scraped from it could also be included in medicinal preparations intended to protect someone after suspected poisoning. The belief fit comfortably into a broader idea that nature contained hidden sympathies and protective substances. If poisonous animals existed, perhaps nature had also created special materials capable of defeating poison. This logic extended to numerous strange objects. Animal horns, unusual stones, rare minerals, and exotic substances could all acquire reputations as antidotes. Their rarity often increased their credibility. Something ordinary seemed less likely to possess extraordinary powers, and royal courts could afford extraordinary things. The result was an entire defensive culture surrounding elite dining. A ruler might have trusted servants, carefully guarded kitchens, silver vessels, precious stones, bazaars, and supposed unicorn horn, all standing between him and an imaginary assassin lurking somewhere near the roast chicken. Most of these objects provided far more psychological comfort than actual protection. But that comfort mattered. Without reliable toxicology, people had no easy way to determine whether a mysterious illness resulted from poison, infection, contaminated food, or natural disease. Every unexplained death could strengthen existing fears, and when an expensive protective object appeared to work, nobody could easily prove otherwise. After all, if you drank from your special cup and survived dinner, perhaps the cup had protected you, or perhaps nobody poisoned you. There was one way to obtain slightly more convincing evidence. Instead of trusting a gemstone, you could give the suspicious food to something alive, and that is where poison detection became considerably less pleasant. Eventually people arrived at a poison detection method that seemed considerably more practical than asking a gemstone for its opinion. Give the suspicious food to someone else. Food tasting became associated especially with rulers, nobles, and other powerful figures who feared assassination. Before an important person ate or drank something, a servant or trusted official might taste it first. If the taster remained standing, dinner could proceed with slightly less anxiety. At first glance, the system seems perfectly logical. If the food is poisonous, the taster becomes sick. If the taster is fine, the food is safe. Unfortunately, poisons refuse to cooperate with such a convenient timetable. Some toxic substances could produce symptoms quickly, but others might take much longer. A taster could eat a mouthful, wait several minutes, feel perfectly normal, and unintentionally give the meal an enthusiastic seal of approval. The important person could then eat the same dish. Everyone would be reassured, and everyone could still be in trouble. Animals could also be used when people wanted to determine whether a substance was dangerous. Dogs, birds, chickens, and other animals might be given suspicious foods or experimental remedies. If the animal became ill or died, people could interpret this as evidence that something harmful was present. This was crude toxicology, but at least relied on observation rather than the supernatural reputation of an expensive object. Even then, the results could be misleading. Different animals respond differently to substances. The amount consumed mattered. Symptoms could take time to appear, and if an animal became sick after eating something suspicious, determining exactly what had caused the illness remained difficult. Still, compared with hoping your emerald looked slightly offended by the soup, animal testing had an understandable appeal. Food tasters also served another purpose beyond detecting poison. Their presence created security. Anyone attempting to poison a ruler now had another obstacle to overcome. Kitchens could be guarded, ingredients could be watched, dishes could remain under supervision. Servants could taste food before it reached the table. The real defense was therefore often not the tasting itself, but the controlled chain surrounding the meal. Yet despite all these precautions, poisoning could still happen. And once someone began showing suspicious symptoms, detecting poison was no longer the immediate priority. Now the desperate question became much simpler. How do you stop it? Unfortunately, historical antidotes could be even stranger than the methods used to detect the poison. Once someone believed they had been poisoned, the problem changed immediately. Detecting the poison no longer mattered quite as much. Now you had to survive it, and before modern toxicology, people developed an extraordinary collection of supposed antidotes. Some were based on medicinal traditions stretching back to antiquity. Others involved rare ingredients, animal products, herbs, minerals, and mixtures, so complicated that preparing the cure could become an adventure of its own. One of the most famous was theriac. Theriac developed from ancient medicinal traditions and eventually became a celebrated compound remedy in medieval and early modern Europe. Recipes varied, but some versions contained dozens of ingredients, including herbs, spices, resins, and even preparations involving viper flesh. The logic was partly that a powerful mixture could combat a powerful poison. Apparently, when facing possible assassination, simplicity was considered suspicious. Theriac became enormously prestigious. Apothecaries prepared it, physicians recommended versions of it, and cities sometimes supervised its production because people wanted reassurance that they were receiving the genuine substance. Another famous remedy was the bezoar stone. As we saw earlier, bezoars were masses formed inside certain animals. They were believed not only to detect poison, but also to neutralize it. A bezoar might be placed into a drink, touched against suspicious food, or used in preparations intended to counter poisoning. Other treatments involved vomiting. This at least followed understandable reasoning. If something dangerous had recently entered the stomach, getting it back out seemed sensible. Historical healers therefore used various substances intended to induce vomiting or purge the body. Unfortunately, treatment could become dangerous itself. Without knowing exactly what poison had been consumed, how much had entered the body, or how it acted, choosing an effective remedy was extremely difficult. Some supposed antidotes did little. Others could potentially make an already sick patient even weaker. Yet people continued using them because the alternative was often simply waiting. And that uncertainty explains why anti-poison medicine attracted so much attention. A mysterious powder, elaborate antidote, rare gemstone, or carefully prepared medicine offered something incredibly valuable, the feeling that action was possible. Sometimes a patient recovered, strengthening the antidote's reputation. Sometimes they did not, and without modern testing, separating coincidence from genuine effectiveness was extraordinarily difficult, which brings us to the strangest part of the entire story. For centuries, many poison detection methods survived not because they reliably worked, but because proving that they did not work was surprisingly difficult. For centuries, the biggest problem with detecting poison was not that people lacked ideas, they had far too many of them. Silver spoons, precious gemstones, bezoar stones, supposed unicorn horns, food tasters, animals, elaborate antidotes, and carefully guarded kitchens all promised some degree of protection. The difficulty was determining which methods actually worked. Without modern chemistry, that was extraordinarily difficult. Imagine a nobleman who believed his special drinking cup could detect poison. He used it every evening for 20 years and remained alive. From his perspective, the evidence looked excellent. The cup had protected him for 20 years. Of course, there was another explanation. Perhaps nobody had tried to poison him. This simple problem helped unreliable methods survive for generations. When someone used a protective object and survived, the object received credit. When someone became sick despite using it, people could argue that the poison had been unusually powerful, the protective object had been used incorrectly, or the victim simply received too much poison. The belief could therefore become extremely difficult to disprove. Fear made these methods even more attractive. Poison was terrifying precisely because it could be invisible. A sword was obvious. An attacker entering your bedroom was difficult to misunderstand. Poison could supposedly arrive disguised inside wine, medicine, sauce, or an innocent-looking piece of food. You might not realize anything was wrong until symptoms began. So people created rituals of control. Food was watched. Servants were trusted or distrusted. Cups were examined. Silverware was inspected. Precious objects were brought near meals. Someone might taste the food first. Most importantly, these actions made people feel less helpless. And not every precaution was useless. Guarding kitchens, controlling access to food, watching preparation, and maintaining trusted chains of servants could genuinely make deliberate poisoning more difficult. The strongest protection often came not from magical objects, but from preventing suspicious substances from reaching the meal in the first place. Gradually, science transformed the situation. As chemistry and toxicology developed, investigators became increasingly capable of identifying particular substances through systematic testing, rather than relying on whether a gemstone behaved strangely. Poison detection moved from the dining table toward the laboratory, but the older methods reveal something deeply human. When people face an invisible danger they cannot properly understand, they search for patterns, rituals, objects, and explanations that restore a sense of control. Sometimes those methods help, sometimes they merely make you feel safer, and sometimes you are simply eating dinner with an expensive narwhal tusk nearby, hoping for the best.